Hey, I'm Chris Ralph, the professional prospector, and today we're starting a new series on aluminum. It's industrial, it's important. You might think of aluminum cans, but it's used in a lot of things where you need lightweight and strength. It's a very strong metal. It's actually the second most metal that's made by mankind. Only iron, there's more iron manufactured and processed than there is of aluminum. But the next most abundant metal as far as what we make and what we use in our modern society, it's aluminum. And so it's a really important metal and used very, very commonly, especially in things like automobiles and airplanes and that kind of stuff. In this series, we're going to talk about all kinds of things. You know, aluminum is in a lot of different kinds of minerals. And in fact, actually about 8% of the Earth's crust is aluminum. And that's a big percentage. It's like around 1/12 of the Earth's surface is aluminum. And so it's the third most abundant element, only behind oxygen and silicon, which are 1 and 2. Aluminum is third, and so it's in a lot of different kinds of minerals. We're going to talk about a lot of different aluminum containing minerals, and we're going to talk about aluminum ores. I'm going to show you what ores look like this.
This is some aluminum ore in a small aluminum mine being taken out of the ground, and shows you kind of what it looks like, or at least what some of it looks like. We're going to talk about the formation of aluminum ores and how valuable they are and the geology of these deposits, and we'll get to that a little later on in the video.
Now, aluminum is in a lot of different rock forming minerals like common rocks, granites, and things like that. Common minerals, a lot of them have aluminum in them, in the common minerals that make up these rocks, like feldspars and micas and all kinds of other stuff, and we're going to kind of get into that. But one of the things I want to talk to you about is that aluminum was once a rare and uncommon metal. Even though it's abundant in the Earth's surface, it was hard to make until they developed a way of making it cheaply. It was hard and expensive to make and very, very rare. But they knew that it was resistant to corrosion and a lot of other things. It had a lot of great properties. It didn't rust. You know, this is an old aluminum piece of angle iron that I own, and I've used it for things. Aluminum, it just doesn't rust. And so what they did was, it was such a rare and unusual high-tech metal that when they built the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., to commemorate George Washington, they put a cap of this rare high-tech metal on top of it, aluminum. And at the time that they made the cap and put it on, it was the biggest piece of aluminum on Earth. Here's a drawing of them placing the cap on top.
You can see from this illustration that the cap isn't very big, and in fact, it really only weighs a little over 6 pounds. It was 100 ounces, but it was so valuable and so precious that they, like I say, weren't even sure when they made it that they could easily make one this big.
And after 50 years of being in place, they put it on top in 1884. And aluminum, the price of aluminum in those days was about the same range as silver. It was almost a precious metal, but not quite. But they knew it had lots of uses and a lot of potentials, and it's really abundant. And, so somebody decided, a lot of people did research and tried to figure out how to make aluminum cheaply, because in those days, like I say, it was really expensive. But after 50 years on top of the Washington Monument, they went up there and took a look at it. And here's a picture of it taken in 1934, because they put the thing up there in 1884.
And here's a black and white photo from 1934 of the aluminum cap on the Washington Monument. And you can see they had difficulty casting this. The lower middle section there that kind of looks dark, that's just a porous, really low quality casting. It's clearly a government job.
And like I say, it was the largest piece of aluminum at the time. But only a couple of years later, two people independently, one guy in France, another guy in the United States, developed a process to produce aluminum more cheaply. And a few years later, the guy in America, his name was Charles Hall, built a plant outside of Pittsburgh to make cheap aluminum. And he was incredibly successful. Now those aluminum plants, or plants more or less like it, exist all around the world. And let me show you the diagram of how this works.
This is how they do it, and it's still how they do it today. They put basically they take cryolite, which is aluminum sodium fluoride, and they put it in a container, a large container, and they heat it to a bright red heat, and they mix in bauxite, which is basically what they put in is cleaned up processed aluminum ore, and it dissolves in the molten cryolite. This is almost like lava. It's really hot, but it'll melt, and then they put electricity to it. They have graphite carbon anodes, and then the tank will serve as the cathode with the negative charge, and the electricity going through there causes a reaction that molten aluminum will sink to the bottom of the tank and be pumped out, and then actually oxygen with some other things, mostly oxygen, comes out the top and is treated as the off gas. And this is basically the process that they came up basically to electrolytically capture aluminum, and it's this process that's enabled aluminum to go from being super expensive and as valuable as silver to being relatively cheap.
And here's what a plant actually looks like in the modern day. They have so many of these cells. Each cell is making aluminum metal. These cells make aluminum cheaply, and they're all located all over the world. And they process, like I say, we process a huge amount of aluminum ore to make aluminum metal. Now, a huge amount of electricity is used in making aluminum. In fact, some people actually call aluminum solid electricity because so much electricity goes into making aluminum metal. The electricity has to heat the material up until it's molten, and then has to keep it hot, and then the electricity has to go through and convert aluminum oxide into aluminum metal, and so you can't really make aluminum unless you have cheap electricity around. Now, all aluminum ores have to be purified before they can be put in the process to be turned into aluminum, and the process involves basically dissolving all the ore with hot lye. Again, electricity is necessary to have that really hot lye that will dissolve the aluminum ore. What happens is the parts of the ore that aren't aluminum don't dissolve and end up as a solid residue that is a waste. It's mostly iron and silica, but sometimes other things. But the chief thing that they happen, because in order to be aluminum ore, it has to be mostly aluminum, and then they'll dissolve it, they extract the aluminum chemicals out of the ore with hot lye, and then purify it, and then treat it again to precipitate out the aluminum oxides. They dry that, they prep it, and then it's ready to go into those cells like Charles Hall developed that will take the aluminum or the aluminum oxide and convert it into aluminum metal. So since Hall developed that process, the price of aluminum has continued to fall, and we've continued to make more and more of it. And as I say, it's become an incredibly important metal to our modern high-tech society. You have no idea how much stuff is made out of aluminum. It's not just aluminum cans. It's an abundant element. We talked about that. There's lots of minerals, and we're going to actually get into aluminum-bearing minerals, including aluminum-bearing gemstone minerals, in a later part of this same video. And it takes lots of electricity to make it. Like I say, some people call it the solid form of electricity. Now, the outlook for all base metals is actually very positive right now, and there's lots of people that recycle. We'll talk a little bit about that too. But I want to say that aluminum is not a real high value metal these days. You know, it used to be about as expensive as silver, and silver, as I'm taping this video, is in the ballpark of around $26 an ounce, whereas aluminum is currently, as I tape this, only about 90 cents a pound. So silver is now much more valuable than aluminum. Aluminum is no longer the rare and unusual element that it once was when they cast the cap for the Washington Monument. It's now a very common metal used in many things. So with the modern process of aluminum to make aluminum metal, as time has gone on since the first plant was built in the 1880s, it's just gotten cheaper and cheaper and more abundant for use until today, when, like I say, it's the second most common metal used industrial in our societies. Now, aluminum is not quite as strong as steel, but it's about 1/3 of the weight, and that, you know, accounts for a lot of things. And like I say, it's used not just in cans, but in all kinds of applications. The lightweight properties of it make it important for use in things that move. Automobiles, especially airplanes, where lightness is super important. Now, automobiles, you know, it's, you know, there's still a lot of steel used in an automobile, but in airplanes, boy, they try to use as much lightweight material as they can.
Aluminum is used both structurally and in the skin of the plane, although in most planes the skin is painted, but in this one they've polished the aluminum and made it shine like a mirror.
Aluminum is a little bit on the brittle side. It's not super malleable. You know, some metals like steel, when you get it red hot, man, you can pound on it and really move it around. Aluminum, you get it hot and it gets even more brittle. So it's not a really very malleable metal, but a lot of alloys are added to aluminum to make various products. It's really important in casting. You know, the Washington Monument cap weighed a little over 6 pounds. It was 100 ounces in weight. And at the time it was the largest casting in the world. But these days we have castings all over the place that are much larger than that. If you own an automobile, you probably have a casting of aluminum that's bigger than 6 pounds, a lot bigger than 6 pounds. And in fact, most of the bell housings on transmissions and that sort of thing are aluminum. And they're aluminum castings, and they weigh more than 6 pounds. It's also used in all kinds of other things, castings for brackets and other. Your hard drive is probably sitting in a cast aluminum frame. Radios, that sort of thing. This is a little carburetor from my lawnmower. I had to replace the carburetor, and this is the one that came out that was in there that wasn't working. It's an intricate, very intricate casting that has to be very exact and can't be loose and easy, and they don't want to have to machine it after casting it. They want it to be as exact as possible, so they do a minimum amount of machining. It works great for that. A lot of aluminum goes into castings and things like this. Like I say, a lot of aluminum is used in cans, and literally millions of these cans are made every year all over the place in many countries. Aluminum is a good conductor of heat and electricity. They used it in houses for a while, but found that in certain situations it could be generating too much heat and lead to fires. But it's still used for things like heat sinks, where it's conducting heat away from something. If you have a computer, like a desktop or that sort of thing, it probably has a heat sink on it, maybe more than one, and a lot of those heat sinks are made of aluminum. And of course, it's very rust resistant or corrosion resistant in just the air and water. Now, aluminum is actually a very active metal. It reacts very quickly in the right kind of circumstances. When it's exposed to acids or strong bases, it will corrode and react. Just in the air and fresh water, that sort of thing, it's not so bad. It actually does a pretty good job. But in more corrosive types of acidic environments, it's a very reactive metal. The trick of aluminum is that it forms a thin oxide coating on the outside of the metal, which then protects the metal underneath. And there's actually things that you can use to get past that oxide coating, and well, it will allow the aluminum to just basically, you can put it in room temperature water and it will bubble off hydrogen. So it's a very reactive metal, but because of that oxide coating, it resists corrosion or resists oxidation in air and water. And this corrosion resistance leads to a lot of applications for like outdoor decorative types of stuff that you'll see made out of aluminum. It's also non-toxic. You know, a lot of metals, heavy metals, have a certain level of poisonous quality to them. But aluminum, boy, it takes a huge amount of aluminum to cause a problem. Actually, in the old days, Rolaids used to be made in part out of aluminum hydroxide, out of aluminum chemicals, and you know, people ate them as a medicine. I certainly ate more than my share of Rolaids back when I was a little younger, in the days when Rolaids were mostly made, or at least a good part of it was made out of aluminum chemicals. Aluminum can be alloyed with almost any kind of metal. Most metals will alloy with aluminum. That's not really true of steel. Some metals will alloy with steel and some won't. But aluminum, a lot of things will alloy with aluminum. And it's also non-magnetic and non-sparking. Aluminum, cast aluminum parts and pieces are used in applications where you need a non-sparking type of device. You don't want to create a spark. Think of the nozzles on a gas pump hose. The nozzle that goes into your vehicle to fill the car with, well, those are almost always made out of aluminum because it's non-sparking. You certainly don't want to create a spark as you're trying to put gasoline into your fuel tank. That could be really bad. So non-sparking, non-magnetic, good properties to have that aluminum has. And those properties are what make it so popular and so usable and so common, together with the fact that it's pretty cheap stuff. So let's talk about some related things like aluminum ores and gemstones. We're going to talk about aluminum ore geology, how it forms, and aluminum ore mining. So aluminum, because it's so common, as I mentioned, is found in loads of gemstones. In fact, a lot of gemstones have aluminum as an important part of them. Let's take a look at some of those different gemstones.
Perhaps the first most important gemstone that has aluminum is corundum, which is ruby and sapphire. It basically is just aluminum oxide and is really not that much different than the material that goes into making aluminum metal. It's just doesn't have the water in it, but by the time it's purified, it's pretty close to this. So here's the first gemstone, ruby and sapphire. Next we have spinel, which is an aluminum magnesium oxide. The oxides like this are very hard and make great gems. Next on our list is emerald, which is a beryllium aluminum silicate, colored green by traces of chromium. Next is topaz, which is an aluminum silicate mineral that comes in many colors but makes beautiful gems. Next is tourmaline, which has a very complex chemistry. It's got boron and aluminum and silica and then other metals in it. And it comes in beautiful colors, not just pink like this, but just all the colors of the rainbow. Finally, here is turquoise that comes in basically blues and green colors. It's a copper aluminum phosphate. And, you know, I hope you get a feel with all these different minerals that when I say aluminum is found in a whole lot of different minerals, that yeah, that's true, and we've only just looked at a few gemstones, and this isn't even a complete listing.
Now, aluminum is a part of a lot of different minerals. Like I say, it makes up 8% of the Earth's crust by weight. And so there's a lot of different ore potential minerals that could be, different kinds of minerals and deposits that could potentially be used as aluminum ores. These include, of course, the most important one is bauxite, but it also includes things like alunite and some other minerals, diasopor, and just some other aluminum rich minerals. The chief one, though, is bauxite, and it's been mined in various places all around the world. It forms kind of in an unusual way by weathering. It's not like the earth puts out a lot of aluminum and here's a deposit of aluminum. Basically, it's a subtraction process. So there's rocks on the surface that have a good percentage of aluminum, and then over years of weathering and leaching, rainwater coming down and the material just sitting there, or at least a lot of the non-aluminum parts of the rock are washed away and leached away and go out and go into the water table and maybe into a river and flow out to the sea. The parts that aren't aluminum get washed away, and the aluminum, and to the same extent iron and a lot of quartz, silica, get left behind. And so you have accumulations of these highly weathered rocks called, and they are, a lot of times, depending on the exact details, is called bauxite.
This is what bauxite looks like, and this is a specimen actually from Baux in France. It has these little circular eyes very commonly, but it's not always like that. These little eyes form as a part of the weathering process, but in some places, depending on what you're starting with, you get bauxite that really doesn't have the little eyes. They're called pistolites, but not all of the ore has them. And here's an example of some bauxite ore that doesn't have those pistolite eyes in it.
Because of the way this works, the deposits are surface type deposits, because the surface gets leached and weathered the most, but they can extend over huge areas as long as you have a stable surface. If you have like mountains and that kind of thing, you'll find that the material gets washed away and eroded. But if you have a fairly flat type of environment, a lot of times it's things that are semi-tropical or tropical in nature, so they get lots of rain. And it just is a long process of weathering to naturally leach all the not aluminum, or at least most of the not aluminum parts of the rock away. Sometimes it can occur in drier areas. Australia is a good example of this, that once were dry, but the surface has been stable for so long that the rocks have been weathered and leached, and the not aluminum parts of it have been leached away. Australia, some of Australia is wet, but a lot of Australia is fairly dry. And you wouldn't think, well, gee, how is it leaching in Australia? Well, in the distant geologic past, it was wetter in Australia. And so the surface is stable, it leaches out, and you end up with significant deposits of aluminum ore, or this bauxite, or bauxite is not really a single mineral. It's a mixture of various aluminum oxide, hydrate types of minerals, and so but it is the ore. It's what they call the ore of aluminum.
This is a diagram of what that would look like. You have basically your soil on the surface that has plants and things growing in it, but then below that you have a layer of highly leached material that is bauxite. This diagram shows two layers of bauxite, a cemented and a pistolitic. But then below that, where it says ironstone layer, that's basically the material that has been leached some, but not leached enough to turn into bauxite. And this is what that would look like in real life, where you have a crust or soil layer up on the surface, and then you have your bauxite underneath that, and then the saprolite at the bottom is the material that's been leached, but not enough to completely turn it into bauxite yet.
Because of the way this works, the deposits are surface type deposits, because the surface gets leached and weathered the most, and but they can extend over huge areas as long as you have a stable surface. If you have like mountains and that kind of thing, you'll find that the material gets washed away and eroded. But if you have a fairly flat type of environment, a lot of times it's things that are semi-tropical or tropical in nature, so they get lots of rain. And it just is a long process of weathering to naturally leach all the not aluminum, or at least most of the not aluminum parts of the rock, away. Sometimes it can occur in drier areas. Australia is a good example of this, that once were dry, but the surface has been stable for so long that the rocks have been weathered and leached, and the not aluminum parts of it have been leached away. Australia, some of Australia is wet, but a lot of Australia is fairly dry. And you wouldn't think, well, gee, how is it leaching in Australia? Well, in the distant geologic past, it was wetter in Australia. And so the surface is stable, it leaches out, and you end up with significant deposits of aluminum ore, or this bauxite, or bauxite is not really a single mineral. It's a mixture of various aluminum oxide, hydrate types of minerals, and so but it is the ore. It's what they call the ore of aluminum. The process for this geology takes a long time. Even in wet tropical regions where there's lots of rain, it still takes millions of years to leach the non-aluminum parts out of the rock. And it can be many different kinds of rocks, can be your starting point. It just has to have a lot of aluminum and not too much iron or too much silica, quartz in the material. It has to have a fairly high concentration. And a lot of these ores have a recoverable percentages of aluminum actually in excess of 50%. So very high percentage of aluminum. And so even at 90 cents a pound, if it's more than 50% aluminum by weight, an American ton, 2,000 pounds of aluminum ore, if half of that were actually aluminum, then hey, you've got ore that's 1,000 times 90 cents or $900 a pound. That's pretty valuable. Although the cost of processing the ore and extracting the aluminum metal is not cheap. It's a large part of the cost that we have of 90 cents a pound. The impurities that are in the ore they're not aluminum and they eventually become waste are a function, how much they are and that sort of thing, is a function of what the original rock was that has been leached. Depending on how much iron and that sort of thing, it will determine what those impurities are in the final aluminum or bauxite product. The world's largest producers of aluminum ore are Australia, China, Guinea, Brazil, India, Indonesia, and Jamaica. And a lot of these, if you think about those names, a lot of them are tropical to semi-tropical, except for probably China and Australia, both of which produce aluminum ore from places that were once wetter and subject to more rain in the distant geologic past. Now, as far as aluminum ore mining, of the actual mining of the bauxite rock, the aluminum bearing rock, because these tend to be blanket types of deposits that are comparatively shallow, you might have a gold mine, that goes down 500, 600, 800 feet for a really big pit, but for aluminum ores, they tend to be blanket deposits, and they may be, more like 50 feet, 100 feet, maybe at the most 150 feet. It just doesn't, it tends to be more shallow, but spread out over a large area. And because of this, you know, because it's a blanket type deposit, it's virtually always surface mined, and you use different equipment. Here's an example of some aluminum mining operations.
This is an example of an aluminum mine. You can see it's pretty shallow. It's often worked in long strips like this in a manner similar to how coal mining is done. You see they'll basically strip off the overburden, and then they'll work a strip like this, and then in the next strip they'll take the overburden from the next area and put it in the hole that's left by this one, and then continue to move the strip forward to mine the whole deposit.
Now, this is the end of my series on aluminum, and I hope that it's been a good one for you. Most of my videos are about prospecting for gold. And if you have an interest in gold, if you want to become a better prospector and find gold for yourself, hey, I wrote a book about it. It's a big kind of an encyclopedia almost, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my book right now. So let me tell you a little bit more about my book. It's called Fistful of Gold, and I wrote it because I want you to be able to go out and find for yourself fistful of gold. And you can see that it's an encyclopedia with all kinds of information, pictures, and that sort of thing. It's not in color, but color would have cost me a lot more to have printed, and so the book would have cost a lot more. It's for sale on Amazon, and you can pick it up. I'll put a link in the description below. I also serve as the editor for a prospecting magazine. It's ICMJ's Prospecting and Mining Journal. And honestly, you should check that out. We got stories and information, legal stuff, everything you know to increase your skills as a prospector. I write articles in this every month, and a lot of other very experienced prospectors contribute to the magazine as well. So check the magazine out. Also, I have a website, and the website is at NevadaOutbackGems.com. I'll put a link for it in the description below, but there's gobs of information there that you will find useful in your prospecting efforts. Finally, I want to say that I really appreciate your comments and thoughts, and even positive criticism. Don't come on there and just toss out insults, because I'll just delete your comments. But if you've got helpful things to say and questions to ask, do write and put those in the comments, because I answer my comments to people, and you'll hear from me in responding to you. So if you've enjoyed this video and you like what you see and you're interested in finding out more, well then sign up, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so they'll let you know when I post new videos. And like it and share it if again you see stuff that you really are excited about. And I'll be coming out with lots more new videos, and so we'll see you again real soon.